Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. And welcome to this special occasion, the opening of our SBS Center, Communication for Sustainable Social Change. On behalf of the Board of Directors of this new center and myself, I'm extremely pleased and thrilled that so many of you have decided to come here. And there are even more people who wished us well from afar. So in that sense, it's very good to see such a turnout on this particular occasion. We're not only having a full house, as you can notice, but we also have a full agenda, and therefore I will try to be brief. Some of the documentation and information is available on the table at the entrance, and you walk up outside again. Let me start by stating at the outset that our center does not intend to replace nor compete with other projects and programs on campus. To the contrary, we aspire to collaborate with many, if not all, who are interested in collaborating with us. We aim to be comprehensive and interdisciplinary on the one hand, and focused and down to earth on the other. The specificity and added value of what we offer lies in the title of our center. Communication, which covers a whole range of things, processes and structures, going from interpersonal, intercultural, group, traditional media, over the more commonly known mass media and new media these days, ICTs or information communication technologies, the internet, Facebook, Twitter, digital storytelling, and whatever comes next. But more importantly is the way we are going to address all these communication facilities, processes and structures. And that's what is identified with the second part of our title. What's the role and place of all these communication forms, and how are we going to assess them from a sustainable social change perspective? Because let's face it, we can easily eliminate 75, if not more percent of what currently is happening in our field, either at the level of research or teaching or consultancy, if we don't take that denominator structural change into consideration. We think that sustainability in itself is a Pandora's box, and we will hear from Professor Cox maybe a couple of ways to handle and look at sustainability. So we are not very clear, or we haven't come up with a final answer to what sustainability has in store for us, but it's part of the ongoing perspective and the ongoing activities. The reference to social change also opens all kinds of levels of action and reflection at local, national and international levels. And again, that's a new addition to what we have been doing, because in the past our approach might have been referred to as development communication, with its association to the so-called third world. We have argued in the past that no universal development model exists, that development is an integral, multidimensional and dialectic process that differs from society to society, community to community, context to context. And so, in fact, what we are trying to achieve can be done everywhere. Furthermore, as somebody told me when I just arrived here, the US is the richest third world country in the world. And that was before the current crisis hit all of us. Important challenges lie ahead from a sustainable social change perspective. Though many US mainstream media, copying Wall Street spin doctors I guess, preach that the crisis is about over and that we can go back to business and consumption as usual, the current crisis is having major economic, social and cultural impacts on the disadvantaged everywhere, and especially of course in the countries of the global south. A statistic generally unreported in the media indicates that, and that's a statistic from the World Bank, they estimate that the GDP per capita will fall 2.9% in most developing countries, maybe with a slight exclusion for China and India. This will have significant social and cultural ramifications, such as increased unemployment and a further deterioration of human rights. So the impact of this fall will be large and prolonged and will mark the end of a global development cycle and the start of a period of uncertainty for some years to come. Therefore, I think, and that's what we have in mind with our center, a paradigm shift is needed, a shift towards global sustainable development. Once again, we wish to collaborate and enter into a dialogue with others in this search for both theoretical and applied solutions. Indeed, we don't intend to limit our objectives to an academic exercise, but wish to engage with the real world as well. As you can see on our website, our projects aim to cover a broad area of activities, going from teaching and training, over research, conferences, local and international networking, lobbying and advocacy. We acknowledge that this will not always be easy, and that there is a thin line between scholarly engagement and activism, and that the place and role of public intellectuals in today's world has become less clear and straightforward as it used to be. But that's our objective. And therefore we are also thankful that the local ACTV community station is videotaping this event and will eventually broadcast and web stream it, so that it becomes part of a larger community in which we can engage ourselves and others. And the same is true for the Broker, a Europe-based bi-monthly magazine on development cooperation, which has offered to blog our event and invites submissions from all of you, if not more people around. The blogger, as we do, aims to contribute to evidence-based policy making and making better use of the results and conclusions of research, ongoing and finished, in evaluations and recommendations for international development areas. So in other words, we hope that all of you can take part in this dialogue and search for communication for sustainable social change. Thank you. Let me now invite Chancellor Hollop to address us. Thanks.
Thank you, Jan. I'm honored to be here and delighted to welcome you to this opening of a new center on the campus. I'm reminded that in May of 1929, a group of students calling themselves the Agitation Committee got together to push for major changes on the campus. They wanted to broaden the scope of Mass Aggie from farm-focused courses to a wider curriculum, including classes in humanities and social sciences. They wanted the campus to better meet the growing demand from citizens of all social classes for a liberal education. The Agitation Committee circulated petitions and reached out to alumni for support. Eventually, without much help from the slow-moving, resistant-to-change chancellor, the students got their wish, and Massachusetts Agricultural College became Massachusetts State College in 1931. I'm not sure whether I've heard whether that agitation committee has been disbanded or not, ever, but I think that its spirit, or you could say that the spirit of it, lives here in the Center for Communication for Sustainable Social Change, although you have to admit that the Agitation Committee had a better name. The new center's activities continue a UMass Amherst tradition of advocating for positive social change. The center will carry on the interdisciplinary aims of the Agitation Committee with an ultimate goal of improving the lives of many people around the globe. Unlike the Agitation Committee, however, the Center for Communication for Sustainable Social Change has the full support of the Chancellor. I believe the establishment of this center is a much needed and timely initiative. It will help us meet the objectives we put forth in the campus's framework for excellence. We want to ensure that UMass Amherst takes its place among the very best public research universities in the country. We want to raise the stature of our campus and look beyond our local boundaries. The center's interdisciplinary and international objectives will help us achieve those goals. I'm confident that the center will succeed in its endeavors because it boasts a talented and committed leader and a qualified and experienced group of advisors and followers. I applaud the important work you are doing. I am truly pleased to be here at the opening of the new center. Thank you for your ongoing energy and your commitment to UMass Amherst.
Thank you for having me. I've had a great time looking at the words that make up the name of your organization, and I would have loved to have been at the debates in terms of the meaning of what those words are. And to me, when each one of those is so value-laden, that there must have been a great discussion that y'all had in putting this together. The things from the grad school standpoint that stands out in terms of this, and we think this is terrific. The first thing is it's breaking down stovepipes on this campus, which I think we've had a hard time doing, and it's something that we're chipping away almost daily, and this is another step. The second thing is that we feel it has an international focus. I don't know how many of you realize that the University of Massachusetts Amherst has over 1,500 international students, and that the more that we can break down these barriers and bring more people here, the better that we're all going to be. The focus, it enables us to move a program that we are developing now called Côte to Tell. Côte to Tell is a French term which means that you simultaneously get a doctorate degree at two universities. One would be the University of, for example, the University of Lyon, and the other would be the University of Massachusetts. And again, the communication means that we developed to tie these together will be something that will be special. I picked up on the word sustainable, which has many different meanings. I'm a city planner, and sustainable means something to me as a city planner that I think has an environmental focus, but yet is something that is very, very important. But above all, it is the fact that you're helping to bring an international focus to all of this. We know that our world is not flat. We know that increasingly that we are going to be tied to other places. I just want to give you a couple of examples. University of Massachusetts right now is in the midst of putting together the largest, I think it's the largest telescope in the world in Mexico. And it's in Mexico, the largest. And yet what happens is that's going to be a scientific success. It's going to be great for research in astronomy. And I asked myself when I was down there, what does it mean for the people of Mexico? And somehow in the communications in developing this, there was an ingredient that was missing in this place. While we're able to bring that degree of science, the highest degree of science possible, it might as well we could have put that any place. It was something that we could have done much greater. The second instance is I was working in Paraguay right after the dictator was defeated, and I was on a mission working with USAID. And with a new spirit of some democracy in there, we asked people what could be the greatest thing that we could contribute in the next year. And I said, teach us how to write the news. Teach us how to write the news. And if I had asked, I never expected that answer. And to me, it is something so fundamental in terms of communication. The third one, I was working in Portugal right after the Portuguese Revolution, the peaceful revolution. And the same thing came out. And where is trust in communication? Where is trust in communication? And in the years following that revolution, indeed, you could find the news was not something that you could really rely on in terms of getting a perspective that had a degree of fairness. And so when we look at these things, we put them in perspective, the need to have the conversation that we're having here, the need to elevate that, involve our students, and to begin to have the discussion of making sure that we are an all-knowing world becomes all the more important. So, grad school standpoint, this fits perfectly. We're thrilled with this, and we hope to be in the front lines with you all in breaking down the stovepipes, and so that drag a scientist everywhere place you can find one, and have them come part of this conversation. I think we're all going to be better off. Thank you very much.
The Dean of Social Sciences.
It's a real test to get through there. I want to welcome you all today and thank you for coming. The College of Social and Behavioral Sciences is delighted to welcome this new Center for Excellence into our ranks. I have every expectation that the Center for Communication for Sustainable Social Change with Servaes at its helm will be doing superb work. Jan has already done groundbreaking research on issues related to communication for development and social change and is internationally renowned. Jan plans to make this center an international resource base and focal point for broad interdisciplinary studies into the theory and practice of sustainable social change communication. I am sure that the center will bring great distinction to the college and the university, in part because the ties that Jan has are international already. For example, this fall, Jan is the keynote speaker at 3 different international conferences. In a few weeks, he's going to attend a conference in Bogota, Colombia, discussing dynamic social transformation. Next month, he's going to speak on media for a culture of peace in Thailand, sponsored by the Catholic World Association for Communication. And later in the month, he's going to speak at the International Public Relations and Advertising Forum in Macau on public relations, media, and social responsibility. Actually very glad you're on this continent here today. The center already is at the forefront of producing scholarship that examines cultural and national bases of communication and analyzes the dynamics of intercultural and international encounters. For example, Jan is coordinating a global initiative for UNESCO that takes a lead in visioning future challenges and requirements of communication and information for development. In addition, center investigators are conducting research related to communication and security, environmental communication, communication and sustainable living, disease prevention and health communication, free speech and expression, and much, much more. I'm sure we're going to be hearing a lot about the exciting work that these communication practitioners and scholars are doing as they formulate media and outreach strategies to more effectively enhance knowledge transfer at local, national, and global levels. Please join me in celebrating the Center for Communication for Sustainable Social Change. Welcome, everyone.
Next, Professor Henderson, the new Chair of Communication.
We have a reading next to it. I love this season, and this is a great way to start it. And I look out at this group and see many students and colleagues from the University of Massachusetts. I also want to acknowledge a visiting colleague, Professor Daphne Lenish from Tel Aviv University, who's a very distinguished feminist scholar of communication. This is a wonderful occasion. So welcome, everyone. Welcome especially to Chancellor Holub and Deans Feldman and Mullen and Professor Carbo on the dais, and our distinguished speaker, Robert Cox. I am a new chair in the Department of Communication after 15 years as a faculty member, but the project of global research and intervention has a very long departmental tradition through studies of policy, media influence, migration, and cultural production and participation. We also have a cohort of international faculty and an especially international group of graduate students and graduate alumni from all continents, whose research often returns them to their home countries. Sheila Sarkar, who is here at the back of the room, for example, is a current PhD candidate from India, supervised by Professor Paula Chakrabarty. Sheila has just returned from fieldwork in Srinagar on modernization and the participation of non-elites in technology and economic development. But despite this long tradition, never before have we had such an opportunity for collaborative, systemic research development and diffusion as the Center for Communication and Sustainable Social Change offers. There are practical goals for the center, but as a unit affiliated with the Department of Communication at UMass, I envision its contributions like this. The center will gather faculty across countries, disciplines, and intellectual traditions. It will train student researchers on the ground, indeed on many grounds, locally and globally. It will serve as a context for international learning and exchange, and it will deepen the recognition of communication practices in the international research community beyond probably the most familiar one, which is using media for social marketing campaigns. It will address those campaigns but it will also redirect the research program to basic questions about resource distribution and about meaning in context. Meaning in context questions are not arcane. They're not simply academic gestures. They address how people think about the world, how those ideas help or hinder participation and security in households, communities, and regions, and how they regulate access to crucial resources within and across borders. These questions play a role in determining who can be a citizen and where, with what entitlements, protections, and duties. They also invite us to think about the limits of national citizenship in the distribution and redistribution of the world's resources, where citizenship helps and illuminates, where it obscures or withholds. We recognize sustainability as a popular idea these days, but with depth and commitment behind sustainability as a research and policy standard, it can push back against dependency, power-grabbing, and short-term interest. It's also a great test for researchers how to determine the social and cultural conditions, including the meanings in context, that will support the sustainability of any policy, practice, or movement, and how any such practice will in turn sustain the population that created it or that it is designed to support. Faculty colleague Emily West, for example, is about to embark on a study of U.S. American conceptions of healthcare. And I was reminded of this study when Jan mentioned the U.S. is the world's richest third world country. What difference does it make whether healthcare is imagined and promoted as a purchasable good, a right, a public utility, or, given recent rhetorics, even a threat, when it comes to changing the truly unsustainable conditions of healthcare delivery in the United States? Guns and money are old sustainers in the South and the North, but that's not what the Center has in mind. The new terms of sustainability are development, distribution, localism, and democratic process. The Center for Communication and Sustainable Social Change at UMass will consolidate, develop, and indeed sustain our commitments to social change projects locally and internationally. It's now my pleasure to turn the podium over to Professor Donald Carbach, but again, welcome everybody.
Thank you, Professor Henderson, and thank you, colleagues, for being here. My remarks have two aims. One is to introduce the way our center extends and builds upon work here at the university, and then the second is to introduce our speaker. First, some specifics about work within our center. The center is building upon our 20-year record of distinction in training researchers in communication, cultural research, and fieldwork methods. These methods are being used in the spirit of understanding social life and local cultures, including those features of that life deemed sustainable and those participants within them want changed. For example, doctoral fieldwork has investigated within our department Asian Indian struggles with popular culture in the United States, Native Hawaiian contests with the Navy over their native lands, religious forms of countercultural communication in Massachusetts and in Florida, Finnish conceptions of cell phones, their uses, and their clashes with traditional meanings, cultural discourses about place, water, and contests over nature, political deliberations within local democratic processes. And I want to pause here just to note our colleague and board member, Professor Jairus Hansen, is currently designing a long conference on new media and deliberative practices within democratic societies. And I, as many, look forward to that. The study of free expression around the world and hate speech in Hungary and its implications for worldwide free expression. Health communication among baby boomers, those with Williams syndrome, and the cultural uses and meanings of alcohol in Russia integrate very nicely with the studies that Professor Henderson mentioned that Emily West is engaged in. Practices which silence disadvantaged people in Japan, and so on. I'm simply trying to add a little meat to the bones, the kinds of work that's been done already by those within our department who are affiliated with the center. I feel like I want to note particularly 3 dissertations based upon such field work. Those of Eric Morgan, Trudy Milburn, and Rick Wilkins each have received national and international awards by our national and international associations for their quality. It's nice to have the opportunity to recognize this record of distinction among our students. I want to say a few words very briefly about a particular project that's ongoing at this very moment within the center. And one way we are strengthening and extending this program is through an active partnership with an emerging, game-changing team of international scholars who are located within the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research in Geneva. This team is a transforming change engine, moving research onto a global scale, as our center will do, from a purely theoretical enterprise to one that links scholarship to local cultures. The thrust of this work is a focus on strategic action in local contexts. That is, it solves pressing social problems with attention to cultural scenes and their emergent social possibilities. The UNIDIR team's work is an innovative and intellectual legacy of our work here, particularly as it has involved key concepts and methods developed by those of us here in the department. And these are being uniquely employed to a very powerful effect. The project was designed and is being run by Derek Miller and Lisa Rudnick, and is the first initiative of its kind to bring cultural field research to the design and planning of field-level security initiatives at the United Nations, whether in support of peace operations, international development, or humanitarian action. I became a charter member of the Research Advisory Group, this project, in 2005, and have been in regular contact with the project team since that time. And upon the establishment of our center, both Derek Miller and Lisa Rudnick were made fellows, and UNIDIR has since contracted with our center to serve as the first ever research support team created for reach-back support during our current field operation in Nepal. What we're currently involved in is trying to reduce the involvement of children in violent activities in the eastern Terai region of Nepal. In my capacity as research support director to that team, it's indeed a real pleasure to mobilize resources here at UMass for this pioneering effort. That is, to employ our research traditions into a new domain of theoretical attention. I'm, of course, particularly pleased about this project as Lisa Rudnick is a doctoral student here at UMass, and she has used her education superbly to build unique bridges between the academic, policy, and cultural worlds. This is what our center is all about, and we are delighted to align ourselves with these efforts. And as is evident, our center is capitalizing on a network of UMass-trained researchers, mentioned again by Professor Henderson. We currently have people in Japan, Egypt, Hungary, Finland, Iceland, China, Russia, and so on, carrying out this important work. The center will help us build on this important work, and will strengthen it while creatively applying and developing it. In the process, as we study real-world problems and investigate creative ways of addressing them, we not only create socially relevant knowledge, which of course is important, but we also add educational value for our students. Before I introduce our speaker, do you want to switch it? Now to our featured speaker. Professor Robert Cox holds joint appointments in the Department of Communications Studies and in the curriculum for the environment and ecology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I remember meeting Robbie, as his friends call him, in the late 1980s when he organized a seminar and conference at the National Communication Association, and he has been instrumental in establishing a new subdiscipline within communication called environmental communication. And Professor Cox's principal research and teaching emphases are environmental communication, as well as the critical study of the communication of social change and of social movements. Here are just a few highlights of some of his recent activities. The first edition of his book, Environmental Communication in the Public Sphere, received the Christine Oravec Distinguished Research Award from the Environmental Communication Group in 2006. He's very excited that the second edition is now out, just this past summer, and I think there's even a copy here if you'd like to take a look. His 2007 essay, Nature's Crisis Disciplines, arguing that the emerging field of environmental communication should be considered one of the crisis disciplines, was the lead essay in the journal Environmental Communication, a journal of nature and culture. Earlier this spring, Professor Cox was invited by the European Union's Environmental Agency to deliver the keynote address, Between Complexity and Urgency, at its conference on media and the environment in Lisbon, Portugal. Professor Cox is indeed a scholar, and he's an activist as well. He just stepped down last May after serving 4 terms as president of the National Sierra Club, founded by John Muir, which is America's oldest and largest grassroots environmental organization. He currently serves the club as an advisor on its mission and strategy-related matters, including its Beyond Coal campaign, and in July he celebrated with club members the stopping of the 100th coal-fired power plant in the United States. The subject of his talk today is as significant, as timely, and as important as it could be: communicating climate change, challenges of scale, and the strategic. It's a privilege and honor to introduce to you Professor Robert Cox.
Well, thank you, Donald, and good afternoon, everyone, particularly the officials of the university that were very gracious to be here to help launch. What an exciting idea, this particular center. It's an honor for me to be here today. I'm particularly grateful to Jan Servaes for his very gracious invitation to be part of this launch. It's also a real thrill to be in Amherst after picking up today's collegian and finding once again that this wonderful university town has been named one of the top university communities in the nation. I say that reluctantly from Chapel Hill. It's also good to visit with colleagues like Donald, who was one of that few small members of the band over a decade ago that helped launch this new field of study, environmental communication. And I'm very grateful for his help during those early years. It is an honor to be part of this. The official launch of such a center, I believe, could not be more timely, nor the emphasis upon communication any less important than now, particularly in the face of crises of healthcare, alleviation of poverty, climate change, agriculture, and other issues. Nor do I believe that we have the luxury any longer of looking at these issues in isolation. Tom Friedman, columnist for the New York Times, in his piece just a couple of weeks ago, wrote that we've been, quote, trying to deal with a whole array of problems: climate change, energy, biodiversity, poverty, and the need to grow enough food to feed a planet, but in profound isolation. These, I think, though we would wish to deal with them holistically, immediately raise equally challenging questions of complexity and scale, and in the case of climate change, at least some sense of urgency. So I think it's a sign of how seriously we take these controversies and the questions of how to address them through sustainable communication when disputes about what's the right method or the most effective method for addressing such large-scale system issues break out openly, disputes appearing in the front page of the New York Times, the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal, and other media. I'd like to give you one example. A couple of weeks ago, John Broder, who is a good reporter, writes for the New York Times, wrote a piece on May 1st of this year. Broder had been looking at a particular group called Eco-America. It was founded by a colleague of mine. It's based in Washington, D.C. It is a nonprofit firm that specializes in messaging and social marketing on environmental issues. Now, earlier this year, Eco-America had been attempting to find more effective ways to frame messages about climate change, and also to build support for the energy bill that's now moving through Congress. Now, as I said, Broder's a good reporter, but he nevertheless quoted from the report in a bit of a sarcastic tone. He wrote, instead of grim warnings about global warming, Eco-America advises, talk about, quote, our deteriorating atmosphere. Drop discussions of carbon dioxide and bring up, quote, moving away from the dirty fuels of the past, quote. Don't confuse people with cap and trade. Use terms like cap and cash back or, quote, pollution reduction refund. Now, as you can imagine, Broder's story immediately provoked a firestorm of controversy among many communication scholars around the country, including a cynical column on the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, scathing criticism online from the Huffington Post and other blogs. Broder himself actually quoted Professor Robert Buell of Drexel University in his own article. He quotes Buell as saying that what Eco-America is proposing is simply what corporations themselves already do. Buell said, the form is the same. The message is just flipped. You want to sell toothpaste? We'll sell it. You want to sell global warming? We'll sell that. End of quote. Now, others defended the research that Eco-America was doing, including most prominently UC Berkeley's linguist George Lakoff. Lakoff himself posted a response to Buell's comment. He posted his on Huffington Post. Lakoff wrote, we think mostly unconsciously in terms of systems of structures called frames. Each frame is a neural circuit, and these frame systems are organized in terms of values. In short, framing is a big deal. Now, Eco-America also stressed the importance of these systems and circuits and associations. Don't worry about reading the fine print. It's simply to illustrate that Eco-America took Lakoff's own research in cognitive psychology quite seriously. It argued that the interconnected thoughts, images, metaphors, and emotions that are active in the brains of audiences as they listen to information about energy or climate change are critical to successful messaging. Indeed, the firm argued that if we pay little attention to these associations, then climate campaigners will most likely fail to mobilize the political constituency that's now required in order to demand comprehensive energy policy out of this current Congress. Now, it's foolhardy for me to step into the midst of this particular controversy, so what I'd like to do is something just a little different. I think as important as cognitive psychology is, particularly in attending to the personal, mental, private construction of meaning that is so important to messaging, I believe that such a focus by itself, and I stress by itself, is inadequate to address the challenges of communication involving large-scale system and complex transformations in society. I think the scope needed indeed, for example, to measurably reduce and then begin to roll back human-induced climate change can be hard even to conceive in terms of the changes that are required. This is true not only of the complexities of climate science, but the changes that are required in systems of pricing, production, distribution, as well as the regulatory regimes and the capital investments that sustain these particular systems. The relationships among these various systems that make up the energy complex is quite similar to what French theorist Althusser once called the complex whole. By that he meant a social structure on three levels, the political, the economic, and the ideological, and that the relationship among these levels is what, in his words, are articulated in dominance, That is to say, any single effort or political act or campaign is unlikely to affect that overarching complex of articulated systems. So the question arises, how then to begin to challenge such large-scale system changes in society, such as the energy system in the United States and globally. Now, I think it's obviously quite clear on one level that it's important to, quote, get the message out, or to attract the attention of media, for example. But the point ultimately is not the dissemination of a message, but the transformation of a complex system articulated in dominance and powerfully resistant to change from particularly social movement agents. We've seen this resistance already in terms of the carbon industries of this country, oil, coal, electric utilities that use these sources, for example, in their multi-million-dollar TV campaign and their ads for clean coal, in quotes, as well as the current resistance to healthcare reform in Washington. As a result of that level of resistance to change at this level, climate scientists, environmentalists, and others are increasingly worried that we in fact are failing to translate knowledge into a constituency that is capable of demanding change at the level that is now required. Gus Speth, who just stepped down as Dean of Environmental Studies at Yale, argued in his recent book, Bridge to the Future, that, quote, only a crisis produces real change. And when that crisis occurs, he wrote, the actions taken depend upon the ideas that are lying around. And if those ideas are limiting, so will our actions be. Speth therefore called for a new way of thinking, a fresh conceptualization, even a new vocabulary. So as a result, I've been thinking a lot lately about what are the vocabularies or the discourses that underlie our own thinking about social change communication, particularly in the context of the scale and complexity of the challenge of global climate change. Nothing less than the challenge of the transformation of a complex, powerfully entrenched global carbon economy. Excuse me just a moment. So in the few minutes that I have, what I would like to do is to argue that the scale and complexity of system change also requires a rethinking of our assumptions about the purpose and the design of social change communication itself. And more specifically, what I want to do is explore a curious neglect of the strategic in recent climate campaigns, and also a neglect in our ways of talking about the strategic in the academy itself. Such neglect, Speth might say, limits our ability to imagine the possibilities of change itself, particularly at the scale required. Now, some quick background first. I think it's helpful to distinguish between communication that's aimed at affecting policy or system behavior on the one hand, and that aimed at changing private individual behaviors, for example, campaigns urging us to wear a seatbelt, to schedule a regular health exam, and so forth. On the other hand, those campaigns, what Charles Salmon and his colleagues have called public will campaigns that are aimed at system change, can be defined as organized, strategic initiatives that are designed to legitimize and then mobilize public support as a means of achieving public policy change. Strategic in the sense that the initiatives that are used, agenda building, framing, social marketing, social problem construction, and so forth, are deliberately organized in such a campaign to produce a series of wider structural effects. Indeed, public will campaigns are defined this way precisely because they're intended to mobilize a newly informed public will in ways that lead in coherent fashion to certain achievable outcomes. Nevertheless, a lot of traditional assumptions about this kind of mobilization, even when they're strategically intended, sometimes prove non-adaptive at the scale or the timetable required to meet challenges such as global climate change. This is particularly true of the form used in some of the traditional environmental communication campaigns that sought incremental or discrete, singular reform. For example, in an earlier era, in the 1980s and 90s, such public will campaigns proceeded in a stepwise fashion. First, you identify a problem, for example, acid rain. Second, you get a bunch of physical and social scientists together to propose the technical and the policy solutions for such a problem. Scrubbers on smokestacks, a cap-and-trade system for sulfur dioxide, and so forth. Third, you conduct a public education campaign to develop support for the proposed solution. And fourth, you mobilize the public by focusing it on decision makers that have been targeted swing votes in the Congress, for example, in order to pass legislation adopting these particular solutions. Now, I think this was a viable pathway for public will communication campaigns in the 1980s and the 1990s, particularly at a time when environmental problems like the effects of acid rain were highly visible and amenable to solutions, usually of a singular type, a particular piece of legislation. I think, however, this kind of campaign, the traditional assumptions behind mobilization, appear not to be working as well in the current situation, particularly in addressing climate change. And I think for two reasons. First, we're discovering that our opponents themselves are becoming quite sophisticated in designing their own public will campaigns, as we've seen recently in the clean coal ads, and we're also seeing in the resistance to healthcare reform. And second, I think such campaigns have thus far not succeeded in making change on the scale. Remember the complex whole, energy pricing, production, distribution, the regulatory scheme that legitimizes that, and so forth. And at a timetable that global climate change and other system crises require. On the other hand, recent climate change campaigns themselves have been criticized for their own neglect of the strategic, that is to say, those contingent openings, the lines of influence, and the consequences that are supposed to occur as the result of specific communications to inform and then mobilize the public. So let me take a closer look at what I mean by all of this by looking at a recent climate campaign that neglected the strategic, though it was quite reputable for the excitement it generated, particularly on college campuses a couple of years ago. But also the neglect of certain academic discourses that contribute to this neglect. Michel de Certeau's insistence, for example, that tactics and not strategy are the art of the weak, and therefore social change agents are forever limited to the terrain of the temporary, the opportunistic, and not the permanent. By contrast, what I want to do is end then by proposing that we think of the strategic as a heuristic, that is, a way of understanding contingency and the possibilities of change at those contingent moments within complex systems. And to understand how communication that is more strategically aligned in such moments can enable a process of events that enable certain effects within this larger system. I'll bring this down to earth in a little bit with a couple of case studies that I'm going to look at. Let me start with one. Recent climate change communication, quite popular on college campuses, occurred on April 14th, 2007. It was the Step It Up initiative. It may have occurred on this campus as well, for example. It was on my campus. It was creative in its design, but I would argue was ultimately unsuccessful. But let me start. The thousands of local activists included students, community activists, families, artists, musicians, local public officials, and others who conducted rallies and other creative events and happenings and marches and exhibits in over 1,400 communities across America. The idea for this kind of nationwide grassroots Public Will campaign was the brainchild of Bill McKibben and some of his students at Middlebury College. And their purpose in a step it up demand on Congress was to persuade the Congress to reduce greenhouse gases by 80% by mid-century, the year 2050, to demand that Congress get serious by enacting comprehensive legislation to address that, and to do that by mobilizing thousands of citizens across America on the same day to deliver a simple message to the Congress. So the advantage of the Step It Up approach, using social media along with open source technology and grassroots organizing, lay in empowering the local organizers to create ways to embody that simple message, step it up, reduce by 80% by 2050, in their own ways that adapted to their local communities. Tens of thousands of citizens across America voiced that message on the same day, in concerts, rallies, and speeches from Seattle to Dallas, from Miami to Boston, from Baton Rouge to Salt Lake City, and indeed the different events on the 14th were quite imaginative. Speakers at the Alamo and San Antonio called for a new energy future. Neighborhood activists lined the shore of a lake in Seattle, holding up bamboo poles by the edge of the lake that marked the level of sea rise that scientists predict as the result of climate change. Scuba divers gave an underwater demonstration in the Florida Keys off coral reefs to illustrate the impacts of climate change. Rally speakers on the Boston Common set up laptops just near the stage for those attending to be able to email their member of Congress. And I think most interestingly, yoga performers in Salt Lake City performed sun salutations as an indication of their own personal commitment to reduce their carbon footprint. Afterward, McKibben claimed, quote, "We upped the stakes, moved the debate to the left, and helped to create a great bunch of organizers." Now, that would have been a major achievement. Indeed, if that day's events had upped the stakes, moved the debate in the US on climate change. But did they? I was actually fortunate enough to work with a team of researchers led by Professors Tarla Peterson at Texas A&M and Daniel Indres at the University of Utah that tracked the aftermath of the campaign and was able to interview during the day many of the participants at these rallies across the nation. The results were not encouraging. After the day's events, local organizers did post photos on the Step It Up's website, and progressive blogs, at least, like grist.org and Huffington Post, did carry favorable reports of the day. But the mainstream news media coverage was scarce, if at all. Politically, the days following April 14th, 2007, showed little or no follow-through. Rally speakers and artists and musicians had left the stage, the laptops were folded, and the yoga performers had gone home. Nor did the emails or the photos that were posted persuade the Congress to take up legislation dealing seriously with climate change that year. The 2007 energy bill, which passed later that year, although it did increase auto fuel standards somewhat, noticeably did not take up action on carbon. It actually rejected part of the bill that would have mandated a renewable electricity standard. There was no net impact on the amount of CO2 emissions that were being emitted by U.S. sources as a result of that particular bill. So what happened? What leverage or wider lines of influence had the organizers hoped to create through all of their day's activities, sending emails, holding banners, posting photos, and so forth? And despite all of the excitement of the day, new organizers surely were empowered and felt empowered. How did these hoped-for effects as a result of these specific kinds of communication activities, how did they hope to link in some way related to the scale of change that they sought? Now, by traditional models of framing and mobilization, the Step It Up campaign appeared to do many things right. It urged a simple message, tell Congress to step it up, reduce 80% by 2050, and the campaign did turn out thousands, tens of thousands of organizers at the rallies, concerts, walks, and exhibits. Now, clearly, the Step It Up organizers and the participants themselves believe that their efforts did make some difference, that their speaking and banners and their circulating of petitions were relevant to wider outcomes and effects. As Bill McKibben himself said, we offered a strategy, we believed, that had a reasonable chance of a larger politics. People did turn out from the rallies. They believed they were sending a message. But in one sense, the claim of sending a message makes an assumption about the efficacy of an information-driven campaign. That is to say, that changes, that with the right framing or messaging, that changes in individuals' behaviors can be changed as a result. That changing a light bulb or driving less will ultimately affect a larger politics. But this assumption runs headlong into an enduring conundrum of social change communication, the so-called attitude-behavior gap. That is to say, the belief that only if we develop new attitudes or beliefs, we will then proceed with new behaviors, and that if, for example, we are convinced that the ice caps are melting, that droughts are being sustained, that crops are failing, that in fact we will call upon the Congress to do the right thing. This is what George Lakoff calls the facts will set you free assumption, that once enough people are informed of the damage we're inflicting upon the earth, that they will, consistent with democratic norms, call upon their Congress to act in time to preserve the life-sustaining features of our planet. This, in fact, turned out to be the assumption of many of those that we interviewed at the Step It Up events. For example, a participant in Seattle told our research team that by holding up these bamboo poles, visibly illustrating a rise in sea level, that, quote, people will see what is happening and more awareness will lead to action, end of quote. Yet the evidence suggests this is not necessarily true, that environmentally appropriate behavior doesn't always follow from a shift in environmental beliefs and attitudes. Lazarevitz, for example, in 2007, in a national study of attitudes, found that even when individuals are aware of the dangers of climate change and believe that global warming is real and consider it a serious problem, still believe in a majority sense that it's a low priority for action. Environmental educator David Orr compared this assumption that more awareness will lead to significant change to a cartoon in the journal American Scientist. I'm one slide behind. That's some of the photos from the Step It Up campaign on the Step It Up website. David Orr looked at this assumption that new attitudes lead to new behaviors and ultimately a larger politics by comparing it to this cartoon in the American Scientist. It shows scientists puzzling over how to balance an equation standing in front of the old blackboard. One scientist has scribbled in the middle of the equation, then a miracle occurs, and the equation is balanced. David Orr commented that, quote, most strategies of social change have a similar dependence upon the miraculous. That is, many social change campaigns, like the Step It Up effort, seem to lack any coherent account of the strategic or the intervening lines of influence that are required to get the desired outcome to balance the equation. Now, such hope for the miraculous did seem to sum up the attitude of many that we interviewed at the Step It Up events. One of them told our interviewers, he was at the Boston Common, for example, that, quote, just having all these people here means that the politicians can't ignore it, end of quote. Others expressed the hope that, quote, the people, like the local politicians and the national politicians, actually do something, but confessed, I don't know how that happens. I guess through everything, politics and art and all that, eventually people will take action and do something about it. They didn't. I don't believe that outcome was inevitable. So the question then becomes, what does it mean to resolve the strategic neglect of recent campaigns such as this. How do change agents who, within a system of power, have less power, use finite resources, their speech, intelligence, their bodies, their imagination, their courage, in order to influence real change within that system. At its core, this is a question of rethinking the strategic, but within social theory and some within the humanities, the strategic is somewhat suspect. Let me turn briefly to that and then to the campaign that I think begins to get it right. As a way of thinking about strategy, about power, strategy has traditionally been thought, in Desserteau's words, to be an art of domination. That is to say, from Sun Tzu's classic Art of War in the 4th century, to Clausewitz, to contemporary war planners, that strategy has been seen as an instrument of power, not a challenge to it. The Rand Corporation's, for example, the Rand Corporation's new framework for strategic analysis begins with the assumption that the strategic is the prerequisite of theater commanders and national authorities. Social theorists as well have tended to dismiss strategy as a resource available only with those with power. James C. Scott, for example, in his classic work, Domination and the Arts of Resistance, observes that for those under domination, the ways of survival, but not of transformation of the system itself, are the maneuvers and the, quote, hidden transcripts of resistance. That is to say, the small acts of subversion, irony, refusal, and deception. Conceived thus as an art of domination, strategy is the deployment of power for the purpose of reproducing its own status. Let me turn to what I think is the clearest statement of this thesis, and that is Desserteau's statement in his book, The Practice of Everyday Life. Desserteau said, I call strategy the calculus of force relationships, which become possible when a subject of will and power can be isolated from an environment. A strategy assumes a place that can be circumscribed as proper, and thus serve as the basis for generating relations with an exterior distinct from it, competitors, adversaries, clienteles, and targets. Now, Desserteau was interested in examining what he called the practice of everyday life. That is, the activities, the making, the hidden productions, in his words, poiesis, that are available to cultural consumers in the context of larger systems. Systems of production and systems of power. Now, he insists that such systems leave no space for the ordinary citizen. And thus the art that defines the practice of everyday life for the cultural consumer is, in Desserteau's words, the art of the weak. It is tactics. He argues that tactics, on the other hand, are a calculus which cannot count on a proper, a spatial or institutional location. The place of a tactic belongs to the other. A tactic insinuates itself in the other's place, fragmentarily, without taking it over in its entirety. It has at its disposal no base where it can capitalize on its advantage, prepare its expansion. Strategy is therefore a privilege available to power, the state, institutions, and systems of relation that are able to secure their borders, to preserve their status. The proper, which is the prerequisite of strategy, therefore, is a victory of space over time. On the contrary, Desserteau argues that because it does not have a place, a tactic depends on time. It is always on the watch for opportunities that must be seized on the wing. Whatever it wins, it does not keep. The weak continually turn to their own ends, forces alien to them, not of their making. So a tactic is makeshift in nature. It waits for resources it does not own and did not make. A tactic, Desserteau argues, infiltrates, but does not seek to take over, to win or replace the place of authority. The resources of the weak then are quintessentially temporary. Power or structures that are articulated in dominance are left untouched. Now, let me be clear. I actually believe Desserteau is correct, essentially, insofar as he specifies the proper as the terrain for strategy and tactics as maneuver, as dependent on larger structures of authority. Now, this is the historical positioning of the powerless, and it's this quite differential status of power that constitutes the core challenge to any rethinking of the strategic as a mode of sustainable social change. Desserteau's view of strategy, though, poses a binary. I think it falsely represents the possibilities of change within the larger system, within the proper. That is, while challengers do wait for resources they do not own and did not make, their maneuvers or their interventions nevertheless may enable a process of events or disturbances, perturbations within the system of authority that encroach, take upon, and hold terrain within the proper. So I'd like to propose in the final minutes that I have that we rethink the strategic not as a privilege of power, as does Desserteau, but as a heuristic available to the challenger as a mode of analysis for leveraging a larger force, that is, for affecting power itself. Now, in the remaining time, I want to offer some very tentative theses, and to do so by illustrating these within the context of a campaign that I've had some involvement. But let me say first that this idea of leverage, of course, is Archimedes' famous boast that give me a place to stand, and with a lever I will move the world. Now, as a mathematician, Archimedes knew that the application of a certain kind of effort with a place to stand produces a dynamic that can move or leverage a much larger force. We know this from mechanical engineering, of course, but also in political theory, as early as Thomas Paine in The Rights of Man. Paine, reflecting upon the American Revolution in 1792, for example, wrote that reason and liberty, what Archimedes said of the mechanical powers, may be applied to reason and liberty. Had we, Paine wrote, a place to stand upon, we might raise the world. Now, like Paine, I want to think about leverage as a mode of analysis about power more generally, but also to rethink Desserteau's assumption that only the elite have access to the proper, that is, access to the strategic. So I want to conceive it as a leverage, as a heuristic for campaigns that would seek to alter or transform the complex whole. Now, as a discourse on power, we might say that Archimedes' principle requires two conditions: a place to stand, but within the proper, within a system of authority. And second, an intervention or an application of a certain force that is able to redirect the momentum of other forces at that same place or site. Now, a place to stand is therefore in relationship to a certain kind of site or node where lines intersect, what engineers call a fulcrum. It is therefore a point where an intervention may occur because it has the capacity at that site of affecting the dynamic of forces that flow through that node. Now, this is a bit abstract, so let me bring it into a campaign that I've had a lot more enjoyment being part of than in reading Archimedes. This is the campaign that I think begins to illustrate the glimmer of what a theory of the strategic might look like if it's applied within certain sites and at certain nodes within the U.S. energy system as part of that effort to encroach upon and take and hold part of the complex terrain of U.S. energy policy. Since 2007, A number of citizens, local groups, national environmental organizations, motivated by their concerns over climate change, have been able to defeat or delay the construction permits and the operating permits for new coal-burning power plants in the United States. The Sierra Club has taken a lead in these efforts, and its Beyond the Coal campaign illustrates, I think, some of the strategic principles I've been trying to describe here. The strategic challenge of this kind of campaign, simply put, is to increase the cost of carbon commensurate with its risk, that is to say, its contribution to global warming, and to do so as a fulcrum or mode of leverage that can shift flows of capital to non-carbon sources of energy, the uses of wind, solar, and so forth. Now let me explain. The burning of coal traditionally has been the source of well over half the source of electricity in the United States. Globally, burning coal in coal-burning electricity plants has also been one of the major sources of carbon dioxide, leading contributor to global climate change. Under the U.S. Clean Air Act, authority to build and to operate such a coal-burning power plant is contingent upon permits from state agencies, usually a utility commission. Now, and while such utility commissions might grant applicants the authority to build and operate a coal-burning power plant, that actually is contingent upon the flow of capital that such firms need. They rarely have that themselves. For example, the cost to construct a large megawatt coal-burning plant today runs anywhere from $2 to $3 billion. So financing is dependent upon large institutional investors like Morgan Stanley, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, and so forth. And financing occurs only if these institutions are confident that their investments will be repaid over time, once the utility begins to operate and begins to recover its cost. As a result, the regulatory requirement that applicants appear before a state commission has provided opponents a place to stand within the regulatory regime, and therefore a site for intervention that is possible by not only delaying or blocking individual permits, but as a fulcrum for leveraging much larger capital flows in the U.S. energy system. Some quick background on that. In 2001, the U.S. Department of Energy, spurred on by then Vice President Dick Cheney, urged utility companies in this country to begin a major push to construct new or expand existing coal-burning plants. By 2007, the department indicated over 150 proposals had been entered into the department's log of new plants. Now, as of today, very few of these plants have been built. Donald mentioned we celebrated in July blocking the 100th of those 150 plants. As of 2 days ago, the count was up to 105 permits for new coal-burning plants that had been blocked. The remaining permits are being contested at the local level and in the courts. Now, while stopping any one coal plant is laudable in itself, after all, mercury is a major public health concern, the goal of systematically challenging permits for plants across the country is far more strategic. Collectively, these delays in construction or the denial of permits at multiple sites have the effect of signaling capital markets in ways that affect the direction and flow of capital, of investment in the broader energy economy. Specifically, the delay of a plant or the cancellation of its operating permit increases risk for investors, increases construction cost. And it is this, in turn, that has the potential to shift direction in capital toward more renewable sources of energy, geothermal, wind, and so forth. Indeed, the Department of Energy recently cautioned that proposals to build new power plants are often speculative. They're based upon the ever-changing financial context of power-generating markets. So the slowing or the cancellation of permits have particular meaning in this investment sector. Example is Wayne Allard, a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, who told USA Today last March that right now what you have is uncertainty. When you look at the risks around coal plants at this time, it's very hard to justify. As a consequence, 3 of Wall Street's most respected lending institutions, Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase and Company, and Morgan Stanley, had by late 2008 announced that they were imposing new requirements for financing that would make it much harder for companies to build coal-burning plants in the U.S. Francis Beinecke, one of my colleagues, the head of the Natural Resources Defense Council, said that, quote, sending a potent signal, the resistance of such to such firms is, quote, sending a potent signal to the energy sector that it views dirty coal as a shaky financial prospect and that the smart money is heading toward cleaner, more renewable sources of energy options. In a related development, in July, the mayor of Los Angeles just announced that the city will move away from coal completely as a source for its electricity by the year 2020, in 11 years. That announcement, in turn, led to the cancellation of a proposed expansion of a coal plant, Intermountain Power, in Utah, that was planning to supply the city's electricity. 2 weeks ago, the U.S. Energy Information Agency released its report on percentages of electricity generated from coal. A quarter of a century ago, the United States received almost 60% of its source of electricity from coal. And while that figure has trended downward slightly over the years, it plunged sharply in 2008 and 2009, continuing through this month. Note, this shows not a decline in demand for electricity, though that is also happening, but a decline in the relative percentage of coal as a source of whatever electricity is demanded. Correspondingly, a shift away from coal to cleaner, more renewable sources of energy is also underway. The Energy Information Agency announced that last year wind turbines added over 8,000 megawatts for new generating capacity. That's 42% of all new generating capacity added online last year. And for the first time, wind power has generated more jobs in this country than mining coal has. So let me sum this up. Returning to the challenge that Speth gave us, how do we begin to rethink or to discern a new vocabulary for the strategic? I think the early signs of success of the Beyond Coal campaign suggest that we begin to do this by rethinking the idea of social change itself at the system level as opposed to the interpersonal. And I think while it is important to focus upon interpersonal processes of meaning construction and so forth, that to rethink the strategic is also to rethink this notion of meaning and of communication as signaling meaning within a certain sector of a larger complex whole. So let me conclude by then, and I'll do this a bit hurriedly, outlining 7 brief theses of the strategic that tries to sum up what I've illustrated in the case campaigns of both failure and success. The strategic is first and foremost a heuristic, a way of identifying openings and a mode of leverage within a network of contingent relationships. Specifically, the strategic as leverage requires a, quote, place to stand. That is, a relationship or access to a relevant site within a system of power, de certos the proper. Such sites have relevance to the degree that they function as nodes in a network of contingent relationships. That is, certain actions or interventions, determinations at these nodes alter or redirect the lines of influence or the flow of power in this network. Fourth, a discordant act or a reversal at these sites therefore may produce an effect in itself, but may also signal or initiate a disturbance within the wider network. Furthermore, the effect of such signals or disturbance in the network may be consequential. That is, it reconfigures areas of the proper. The ability to do this, to effect this dynamic act at relevant sites, critically depends upon the application of a certain force, as Archimedes told us. A force with the potential to alter the lines of authority or influence that intersect at that site. And finally, the effect of multiple or similar interventions at multiple sites can amplify signals in the wider network and therefore reinforce the transformations in the direction of authority or power within this system. So let me end by saying simply that leverage is not an analogy. It's an attempt to describe a capacity in contingent moments to affect lines of influence in a larger network, in systems of power and authority. And yet, these interventions are timely, are opportunistic in this assertive sense. They are tactics at that level. And yet they become strategic to the extent that such openings and the leveraging of them are able to produce resonance within such systems that last, that take over, that reconfigure the arrangements within the larger network of power. So as a discourse, the strategic is an accounting, it's a describing of the ways, of the moments of opening, of the contingencies of an act and the consequences of an action. In other words, it's an account of effectivity, how the application of a certain force in certain context then can initiate a series of events that produce effects in the larger system. It's also, as a discourse, a plea that in our social change communication campaigns that we begin the hard work of reintroducing the strategic within our concerns about messaging and mobilization. It's a plea also that we leave behind the hope for the miraculous. And as Archimedes advised us, to do the hard work, to find a place to stand, and to do the work of intervention at those sites. Thank you.
We have time for questions. So if you'd like to pose a question for our speaker, please do so.
I'm just wondering what you think about Jim Hansen's work focused on closing coal plants.
I think Jim Hansen, well, he's one of my heroes.
Me too.
The man is courageous. He survived brutal intimidation under the Bush administration, and he never winced. He has put his own body on the line, arrested recently at a couple of demonstrations in Washington and in West Virginia against mountaintop removal. He is quite insistent that we have to stop immediately all coal production if we're to have a prayer of avoiding that tipping point. He has consulted with the Sierra Club. We look at his work. We are allies, but we move in some different realms. Yes?
Me?
Sure.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you'd heard in the news this week, I just got wind of China, the government, I guess, is contracting an Arizona solar production to do solar in a big way in China. I don't know if it's like millions or thousands.
Yeah.
So how is that going to send a signal home to us?
Well, it certainly adds to the amplification of signals being sent. We were talking with Jan earlier. China is making an effort to introduce solar to help satisfy this huge appetite for energy that's growing in China. It nevertheless does continue to bring online new coal burning plants. The growth and demand of energy is just unbelievable in China right now. I think federal authorities are quite aware of the problem and beginning to do what they can, but very reluctant to take lessons from a nation that has been a bit hypocritical in the past and not changing its own energy practices.
No, I was thinking that the Arizona, if that's a success, that lesson would bring home to us as home, that we could build for a city, do solar for one of our small cities.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I think we are seeing a shift toward more installation of solar sites, retrofitting homes. There are some provisions now in the Obama stimulus package to invest resources in moving toward green job economy and so forth. They include such installations. Yes?
So I was very heartened by the success of the No Coal campaign. Certainly architects took it on as well, the 2020
Yes.
challenge is part of that. But one of the consequences of this kind of systemic change is actually the push towards more acceptability of nuclear power plants, because they do not generate carbon. And in fact, in 2008, there was a U.S. government bill that approved financial backing for financing for nuclear coal plants, and as a result, there have been as many as, I think, 50 new. There was a map of about 250 sites where new nuclear power plants were going to be put on the block. So how do you go about the next challenge, which is to reduce demand, in fact, so that there is no desire to build nuclear power that's now backed by the U.S. government?
Yeah, it's interesting. Rhetorically, nuclear power really has found an opening to resurrect its industry because it can argue it's non-carbon based. I think there are two obstacles to nuclear power. I would not hold your breath. One has to do with liability and the regulatory levels that they have to succeed in before they can get a construction permit, much less an operating permit. There are multiple layers of different federal statutes, each of which require their own NEPA process, public hearings, comment period, and approval and so forth. It is a nightmare for the nuclear industry from their point of view just to get through all of that. As I said, liability is the other issue. Even though there is a federal law that shields them from certain levels of liability, is far insufficient. There's still great concern. And at the site of every proposed nuclear power plant, there will be citizen opposition that will seek the same nodes of leverage that we've seen in the coal fights. So I'm not that certain that we're going to see a real shift to nuclear power.
But in some ways, they've moved the discussion into a distributed mode of nuclear power. They're starting to produce small sites of nuclear power production. In fact, they're marketing it to China and the sort of third world growth as a clean form of producing power for new sites of rural development. In fact.
I've not seen the commercial feasibility of some of those tests yet. Marketing them to those countries, for example, is one way of avoiding some of the regulatory obstacles in this country to nuclear. It's interesting, and you've given me some new information here. I had to look at this. There was a gentleman over here, I think that someone.
Well, I was curious about your perspective on framing, because it's very difficult changing large-scale public attitudes about complex things. And the economists have actually managed to sell the notion of markets as a complex system, although they haven't managed to sell the idea that markets require social institutions to make them work. So what I'm wondering is how much change you've really seen in promoting notions of ecosystems rather than environments. Given that this has sort of been at the heart of the environmental movement since Earth Day.
There have been a lot of efforts to do this over the decades. The problem is that the kind of change you're talking about, for example, the change that has led to an acceptance of markets, kind of naturalized, taken for granted assumption of American political economy, has taken decades, a half century or more. And actually, Lakoff would agree in this sense that framing, properly understood, is at the level of value structures, not just playing around at the level of discourse. And that kind of value re-education takes an enormous amount of time. And therefore, my argument is that campaigns based on just that are non-adaptive at the scale and timetable required in the face of crises. And for every successful campaign that actually takes a step forward in moving us away from the assumption of unregulated markets toward ecosystems, will be met by a campaign with 10 times the amount of financing from those that have a stake in losing out on their frame. This is not a playing field with only one team on it. I wish it were.
It strikes me that one of the pivotal parts of the more successful, at least so far, no coal campaign was indeed showing those investors that this was not a profitable enterprise. Do you think then that the distinguishing characteristic between tactic and strategy is the bottom line? Is that the way towards strategy, away from tactic, is to try to look at financial interests and disrupt those?
I differ slightly. The difference between tactic and strategy is that strategy is a way to leverage larger scale and perhaps more permanent change. In the context of the climate campaign that I described, financial risk was a mode of leverage. But it might be something completely different in another campaign, another context. Financial firms understand risk, particularly in the energy sector. It is one of the most risk-aversive sectors, and investors flee with uncertainty in many cases. So you can leverage that. I'm just pleading that as we design our campaigns, we look for these contingent openings and nodes where leverage can be exercised. And we're able to maximize, I think, the efforts we put into it. That is to say, a smaller force can move a larger force. You can actually figure out that. How are we doing?
Fascinating talk. Giving your definition to place to stand and leverage. It changes with the country to country, to climate, power, who's in power. Yes. Even on a lower scale, you can take university and see a place to stand. But it depends who is in power and whether you will be able to get that place to stand or not. So in this way, talking about situation in the United States is different than what is going on in Europe. The education, the value, the threat is much more emergent there than here. So
I do not disagree. But for example, in Europe, an interesting place to stand in form of leverage are the provisions under the Aarhus Convention. The guarantees of citizen right to know, right to comment or participate in decisions, and the right of access to justice or standing in courts. And it's an enforceable right, unlike in the United States. So, for example, a firm in one of the former Soviet countries proceeded with the construction of a plant without having gone through a process under the Aarhus Convention. And citizens had access to EU places to stand to complain under the convention, and that construction was stopped. So each country and context and culture have different networks of arrangements through which power flows, and the challenge is to figure out where are the contingent openings, where those lines of power aren't overdetermined in one direction, but could be deflected in another if some act of intervention or disruption happens in that place.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the talk. And I'm just wondering if you can elaborate on the connection between the tactical and the strategic. Just because, in particular, I think that sometimes the lack of reflection of the strategic, in particular, talking about like activists and young activists, and also, with the new media in between, they just lack information or knowledge about the systemic aspect, the political in the institutional ways, and how actually practical media or practical uses of the media can be a support, a leverage point for the strategic. And so this is a problem I see when you in social movement, for instance, and when you sometimes they do not recognize each other. I mean, the tactical uses of the media and the strategic, or the strategic aims, and I see a lot of potential though in connecting both. So
I agree. I think there's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding about what is strategy. Some of my own students, for example, when designing a campaign, I said, "What is your strategy?" And they said, "Well, we'll set up a table and hand out literature, and we'll make signs, and we'll schedule a march." I said, No, those are tactics. What's the purpose of doing those things? What do you expect to happen as a consequence of intervening with those actions at this time and place? And they didn't know. And I said, you have no accounting of the strategic yet. I think one of the lessons not learned from some of the successful 60s campaigns, like the Civil Rights Movement, was the strategic. The lessons that were learned were tactics, marches, pickets. But Dr. King was far more strategic. I'm playing with a study now to look at his shift from his strategy of satyagraha, the assumption that when power witnesses suffering willingly experienced by someone, being hit with billy clubs, that it directly appeals to their soul, their conscience. And yet that strategic assumption was not playing out in the South. Bull Connors didn't care that John Lewis was bleeding when he hit him. King shifted to what I think the Hindi term is duragraha, which was the pragmatic use of such things as suffering in order to appeal to the onlooker who can intervene, the conscience of a nation at that time. And in that sense, it was the willingness to place bodies in front of police dogs and allow suffering then to be visibly displayed, knowing it could awaken the conscience of the nation, who in turn had the constituent power to move a president to send in federal marshals. That's strategic leverage as the result of knowing how to intervene in an opportunistic, timely way with tactical actions, but aligned with a larger strategic insight of what was supposed to happen as a result of that. So that's my plea, that we not forget the strategic. Okay.
One last item of business. Again, I just thank you so much. A very stimulating and interesting lecture. And before we adjourn, the annual Communication for Sustainable Social Change Award aims to honor outstanding contributions by individuals or organizations to the theory and practice of communication for sustainable social change. In selecting the first award winner, our jury has considered both significant contributions to the theory of CSSC and notable achievements in applied communication practice. In recognition of outstanding achievement and his ability to get here, the jury has recommended the Inaugural Ward be presented to Robert Cox.